Very welcome to the session Places Resilient to Crisis. During this year and the last year, the place where I come from was hit by the COVID pandemic, by a fatal amok drive, and by fatal flooding in summer. So clearly, there are expectations from the citizens towards policy. And therefore, it is really my pleasure to be with you now to discuss, to kick off the Thematic Action Plan on the places resilient to crisis. For those who have been following the last session already, it will be the same format we do. We will have a panel, an online panel with scientists and policymakers. We have also an expert from the ESPON EGTC, and above all, we have you again to participate in our discussion. Please use the Zoom chat in order to share your thoughts, your comments, and your questions. We will deal with them at the end of this session. So now, to give us a more detailed idea about the Thematic Action Plan, I would like to invite the nice person beside me. That's a super case of a blackout. Michaela, sorry about this.
No problem.
Michaela Gensheimer from the ESPON EGTC. I hope you are all awake now as well, dear audience, to inform us about this action plan in detail. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabine, and welcome also to all the participants in this workshop here this afternoon on the tab concerning places resilient to crisis. We can go to the next slide, please. So the goal of this specific tab is to create territorial evidence on the territorial vulnerability of European places, so be it regions, cities, towns all over Europe, to different types of crisis, to help them in the end to strengthen their adaptation, mitigation and recovery capacities. And we want to do that by focusing on the different types of crises there are. I mean, obviously, at the moment, everyone is thinking of the COVID-19 pandemic, but Sabine, in her introduction, already mentioned several other crises that we have already dealt with, that we certainly will be also facing in the future. So there are plenty of issues we are thinking of in terms of resilience, be it in relation to environmental, economic, social, sanitary, digital, and other issues in that respect, and also addressing all levels of governance. And the purpose for us, as usual, which is generally our purpose at ESPON, is to strengthen the skills and also the capacities of policymakers to further integrate resilience in their own work, so in development of policy strategies and policy-making processes. Next slide, please. Now, the policy context that we find ourselves in when talking about resilience, obviously, is similar to the policy context that you might have seen if you followed one of the other workshops before this session here. So obviously, we take account of cohesion policy, and the topic of resilience strongly relates to most really of the 5 objectives of cohesion policy in the new program period. So be it in relation to smarter Europe, and there reaping the benefits of digitization for citizens and companies and governments, be it in relation to a greener, low-carbon Europe, promoting the climate change adaptation and disaster resilience of European regions and cities. In relation to more social inclusive Europe, also we are looking at developing the climate also developing a climate resilient trans-European network. So it's really that there are multiple overlaps here. Then also we see ourselves in the context of the Territorial Agenda 2030 in relation to just Europe, looking at the social inequalities that exist throughout Europe, also due to technological and economic changes that have taken place and still do take place. Relating to the Green Europe strand of the Territorial Agenda concerning here climate neutral and resilient cities and regions. Then there are also clear links to the new Leipzig Charter, which focuses and wants to strengthen the resilient urban development and also resilient public data infrastructure and governance systems. And last but not least, obviously, also the EU Green Deal is very important here, looking at the increase of climate and environmental resilience. Now, the challenges, trends, and drivers behind this specific topic. So we do know that European territories show very diverse sensitivities to natural and man-made hazards, because obviously all the places are very different. They have their own strengths and weaknesses. But that also means that every region, every city, every town will need to develop their own recovery path to be really very specific for the relevant place. So here we are dealing with environmental challenges, because climate change obviously will have different, we have seen that through different studies and also our own work, climate change will have different impacts on different regions, where we can see that particularly in Europe, it's the southern and southeastern European regions that will be most vulnerable to climate change and will certainly experience the most severe economic and social impacts in that respect. But climate change also needs to be considered together with territorial interdependencies. And this we've heard also, if you happen to be in the workshop, that also took place in this room here in relation to governance. So here climate change obviously is a subject which doesn't respect national borders or any borders for that purpose. So that needs to be dealt with in functional territorial thinking, really. And then social inequalities certainly also play a role here in terms of challenges, social inequalities that we face due to technological and economic changes, also demographic trends like aging, depopulation, migration, and all of these have an impact on the territorial access to public services, to education, employment, and they may result in social exclusion, spatial segregation, and marginalized areas. Next slide, please. Then we're looking at the drivers. So here we are looking at innovation, digitalization, automation, and artificial intelligence. That is what AI stands for here, which are certainly powerful drivers of the change that we experience already right now. But they also put a lot of pressure on European regions and cities for them to keep up and to further adapt to this pace of development, to make sure that they are competitive in a global scale. Which can mean that maybe original former economic strengths of particular cities and regions, and also their size and the accessibility of the relevant domestic markets and their global connectivity, they do play a role when it comes to the potential economic resilience of these places in the future. So diversified economic structures, strong innovative performance and efficient. I hope you can, I'm not sure if you can still see me. I hope you can at least see the slides because we just have a blackout here in terms of lightning, but I'll just keep going. So diversified economic structure, strong innovation performance and efficient transport networks are certainly factors that will ensure regions' access to main gateways and corridors, which are really important aspects to keep in mind when looking at economic resilience. So the light is back on now. Thank you. But irrelevant of the starting point of whichever place we are talking about, cities and regions can follow to a certain degree a pathway to innovation, recovery and resilience by tapping into their respective, really place-based potential, and that is what we want to look at. Next slide, please. Then the trends that we see is that a good crisis response needs to be, I already alluded to that earlier, needs to be really place-based. I mean, we've known that for some time now through different research work that we've conducted. They need to really make sure that the specific territorial strengths and challenges and also development challenges are taken into account so that really robust resilience strategies can be elaborated. And this works best also in cooperation across different governance levels, but also across borders and in functional regions. So that means that cooperation, but also bottom-up initiatives. In the previous workshop in here, there was also a lot of talk of citizen engagement and involvement of stakeholders. So this is also something that plays a vital role here, and looking and exchanging good practice experience. Next slide, please. So possible inquiries, and again, this is just a list of questions that could be relevant for policymakers, and this is certainly where we would need all of policymakers' inputs that are here today in this workshop, but also in the next couple of weeks, to make sure that we really actually meet your demands on what is really helpful for you. So possible inquiries that we're looking at here are how is the issue of territorial resilience formulated in your policies? What would you say are the knowledge gaps that you can identify that prevent you from delivering a more effective policy response? What are the reasons for such gaps? Would ESPON maybe be the right instrument for you to address these gaps? And what would be your specific evidence and knowledge needs for developing better capacity in policymaking? Next slide, please. Then looking more at the research side, and this is where we would be really grateful for getting feedback also from the scientific community that is here in this workshop, on what is your take concerning this topic and what you would feel would be really important for ESPON to look at. So some of the questions we have are: what is the stock of available scientific evidence that is matching the topical profile of this specific tab? We obviously do our own research to make sure that we don't overlap or repeat research that has already been done, but we certainly can't be aware of everything that is going on out there. Another aspect would be: what is the state of art in research work in territorial resilience, and does this research also have a territorial focus, which is of course what makes ESPON so specific to having this territorial focus in our research work. What is the current discourse around resilience, and what are the questions and also debatable aspects that might be further followed by ESPON? And are there really distinct evidence gaps that you can really identify where you would say, well, this is where ESPON could step in and we could really do something about that to fill that gap? And how could we complement also research that has been done by others? Next slide, please. So also for this tab, there is a specific YAMA platform. You can see the link here on this slide. It's also available on our ESPON website. So please don't be shy, be active, join us on this YAMA platform, give your input here. We're going to have a discussion ongoing here for the next 2 months. You can also send information via email. We will come back to that later, I think. And it would be really helpful for us to get your input on that. Next slide, please. And that would be it for the moment from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela, and we of course apologize for this technical little issue. You all know the jokes about movement detectors in public administrations. but I can assure you everyone here is still awake, very much engaged. We just try to be silent and concentrated. So I hope the same applies to you. I'm now looking forward to invite the panelists we have, the online panel. Thank you very much. We have now a good basis, an outline of what the TAP looks at the moment, and we get now input from, again, scientists and policymakers on what their point of view, their focus would be, and their challenges as regards the issue of places facing crisis. First of all, and I have to warn you, I have to be very, very strict with you because we have 5 speakers, so I will be cruel, and please try to keep the time. I invite first now Carolina Sapieri from Sapienza University of Rome to share her presentation with us. Welcome.
Many thanks. Hi, I'm really happy to be here in this interesting workshop. So my intervention, I think there should be the presentation there. So my intervention is about the evolutionary perspective of resilience. So next slide, please. So next. So until now, past engineering and ecological approaches have mainly focused upon short-term reaction to crisis and idiosyncratic shock, and moved back to pre-existing city-state or new city-state equilibria. And I think the evolutionary approach, as really well discussed by Boschma 2015, requires to move to long-term focus to deal with the resilience topic. And according to the evolutionary perspective, the resilience is the ability of systems to withstand and adapt to crisis, but also to undergo transition processes in the long term. So the resilience is a process and is the result of absorptive capacity, which include coping capacity to restore structures and basic function to mitigate the impact of the shocks. Adaptive capacity to adjust the characteristics and function in order to take advantage of opportunities in the aftermath of crisis. And in the long term, the transformative capacity to reconfigure the system so that the shocks will no longer have an impact. So next slide. So as really well illustrated by Benet et al. 2010, so the resilience is a process and is the result of all these capacities, so absorptive capacity, adaptive, and transformative. Of course, as illustrated in the top part of the figure, the more you change, the higher the transactional costs. So costs in terms of course, economic costs, but also social costs, psychological costs, etc. Also, it is important to relate the intensity and the duration of the shock with the capacity, with the specific capacity within this resilient path, because the lower the intensity of the shock, the more likely the household will be able to resist. So the system will be, let's say, stable. As the intensity increase, and also, of course, the duration, then the system needs to change, to be adapted to the new reality. And next, I think we are really into a fourth transition with this COVID-19 pandemic. So we are dealing with a new reality, and it calls for, I would say, not only EU partnership, but global partnership among, of course, the policymakers, the health institution, but also the finance decision makers. And there's the need to integrate the capacity building efforts at all levels. So it is required vertical and horizontal dialogue, but I would say also private-public interplay. And of course, I think it's really needed the flexibility, light, fast policy and policy response and programming in order to be able to react on time to the crisis. And I think there are challenges and opportunities, and the resilience research must help to develop common knowledge for policymakers, but I would say for the general public. And I think there are some arguments which are really interesting, because for example, I would say that the smart working has moved into a new work-life balance, which needs to be tackled from different points of view. Of course, from an economic perspective, to investigate increasing or decreasing productivity levels, or organizational commitment, but also, of course, from a psychological point of view, to investigate social distresses and habit changes. I will also suggest to work on the intergenerational divide, because as I said, the resilience is a process, is a long-term process, and it requires debate between generations. So the public spending must be fairer for the younger people, while keeping the pension system sustainable between generations. So it's a really a field which requires, I think, intense research in order to which matters, of course, for the economic growth and the resilience debate. And of course, as already said, digitalization, automation, but also technological relatedness among firms and sectors, for me, are really the urgent topics which must be addressed by researchers. And okay, I think that's all for my side now. But I'm here for a question.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and for keeping the time, and also for sharing with us the new insights or additional insights on the nature of resilience, which is definitely useful and necessary to understand, and for proposing already fields of action and pointing out where the challenges lie. Thank you very much for the moment. I'm now inviting the next speaker, which is Efren Feliu from Tecnalia in Spain, and he is a climate change manager. Are you ready to share your presentation and experiences? Thank you.
Yes, I'm gonna share my screen. I hope you can see it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, my background and my current work is centered around climate resilience and climate adaptation. And for starting, and I think that my intervention is going to be quite complementary to Micaela's and Carolina. I would like to call the attention about uncertainty. So we have to deal. We are going to have a change, but the order of magnitude and the direction of the change in terms of climate variables is uncertain, and we don't know for sure what is the patterns of extreme events, for example, intensity, duration, or frequency. How is that going to vary? But as a matter of fact, it's already changing. So policy making will have to cope with greater uncertainty, even though that has been part of decision making since ever. Another important element is complexity, and there are no linear cause effects when talking about global change, when talking about climate change, and therefore policy making also has to deal with greater complexity in the challenges we are facing. And therefore, talking about climate resilience, but I think is applicable to a broader resilience concept, necessarily has to deal with uncertainty and complexity. My intervention is going to be related to how addressing this climate resilience challenge in the new ESPON program and the Thematic Action Plan. And the first thing is that it's important not forgetting about previous ESPON outputs and the knowledge that has been developed in previous ESPON projects. And I'm mentioning here specifically 3 projects which I know well, the Greta project on green infrastructures and how demand and availability of certain ecosystem services, which are quite relevant for resilience, as a matter of fact, were addressed in that project. The ESPON Titan, which even though its primary objective was quantifying economic impacts of natural hazards, evidence that vulnerability matters and is not only identifying the order of magnitude of economic loss and damage. And the ESPON climate update, which we are working in right now, with an important update or change in the previous analytical framework, which also is an important sign of how techniques, science is evolving, and we have also to adapt to this type of changes. Okay, in addition of taking into account what has been already developed, specifically with that territorial approach in ESPON, in the field of climate resilience, it's important to take into account, and I will give a bit more details of some of the things or the policy initiatives which were mentioned by Micaela in the introduction. It is important to take into account the huge amount of initiatives that are ongoing and important initiatives promoted by the Commission in the field of climate adaptation. Firstly, the EU adaptation strategy with that those 4 objectives of smarter, faster, systemic, and with international action, climate adaptation, which is addressing many things like water bodies and water quality, nature-based solutions, the climate protection gap in terms of insurance, macro fiscal policy, emphasis on local adaptation, and all those things are already included and could be an important hint for ESPON. It is also crucial to take into account the adaptation mission, which is also mentioning some of the things already noted, like the place-based approach or systemic approach, taking into account that the multi-hazard, multi-scale, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approach is necessary for addressing the climate challenges, but also pointing key community systems and enabling conditions, which should also be an important hint for knowledge development and evidence generation in this arena of climate adaptation. It is important to take into account that the mission is developing resources and mechanisms for preparing all European regions and communities to face climate challenges in terms of generating knowledge, which could help those regions and communities understanding and acknowledging their climate challenges, accelerating, which implies having 150 regions with innovation pathways, climate resilience innovation pathways, and demonstrating and scaling up specific adaptation solutions in 75 regions. Well, this is going to happen. This is being promoted by the Commission, and is something to take into account. Additionally, there are other resources like the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center and the Risk Data Hub from the IRC, also the Peseta report, which, for example, is not regionalized and could be subject also of further developments and potential studies. But importantly, also the Climate Adapt platform from the EA and the Copernicus Climate Change Service. All this is there, and I believe that ESPON has to find its place and to identify where added value and potential contributions could be developed in all this constellation of mechanisms, instruments, and initiatives promoted by the European Commission. And what is the potential way forward? Well, there is an important emphasis on societal transformation, and this was also mentioned in previous sessions, and the scope in this necessary societal transformation could also be subject of analysis and perhaps contribute to generate those bottom-up processes for this. I think that we cannot or we should have an integrated view to resilience, and therefore integrate research and knowledge with other resilience spheres, which are quite interrelated: health, biodiversity, cybersecurity, critical infrastructures, etc. Of course, this also implies that we cannot understand the four thematic action plans as silos, and the interactions between those four tabs is also something crucial.
Sorry, can you start to conclude now, Efren, because time is getting...
This is my last slide.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, okay, so calling that the attention on the integrated view in the framework of the territorial agenda is important. Having an observatory approach, which implies generating knowledge in a dynamic and recurring way, taking into account that uncertainty challenge. There is room for innovation in analytical approaches, but we also have to pay attention to the developments in the framework of Horizon Europe. And definitely with this constellation of initiatives, mechanisms, instruments, it is crucial the communication, coordination, and cooperation with other interested and competent European Commission organisms which are already working in this sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Efren. Sorry for interrupting you.
Okay.
And thanks for this rich material you already contributed as regards the research need, and also focusing on specific issues as regards resilience. So the next speaker I would like to invite is John Bachtler from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. He is director of the European Policies Research Institute. John, and right away, the floor is yours. At the moment, we cannot hear you. We can see the slides. You are muted. And we also see the preview you have. We don't have a presentation view at the moment.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, and I see a proper slide. Thank you very much.
Oh, excellent. Thanks very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a shame we couldn't be in the beautiful city of Bled, but it's an interesting agenda and conference nevertheless. I'd like to sort of focus more on the third of the questions that Michaela presented earlier, and where she asked what are the current discourse questions and debatable aspects that may be pursued by ESPON. And given that the aim of ESPON is to inform, and particularly this TAP is to inform both EU and national policies, I'd like to focus particularly on the national territorial policy level. And this is based very much on a long-standing project called Eopa, and the logo in the bottom right-hand of the screen, where we've been looking at the way in which territorial policies, regional policies are responding across 30 European countries. And I'd like to pick out some of the key issues that we identify in terms of policy thinking and debates at the moment. Given the time, let me just put everything up on screen in this first slide. And I'm really echoing the watchwords that the previous two speakers have made, which is related to complexity and uncertainty. And if we look at what policymakers are trying to reconcile in terms of their ambitions of a more place-based, inclusive regional policy, they're faced with a complex mix of challenges relating to how it is that they can respond to sort of social environmental vulnerabilities, reassessing value change and industrialization trends, the digitalization agenda and remote working, how the citizen can be engaged in a more democratic a process in terms of the problem of rebalancing economies where we've seen widening internal disparities, recovery, and of course, this important factor of increasing social discontent. And particularly looking at the current situation, one hears time and time again, perhaps this slightly hackneyed question, what is the new normal? And in trying to answer the questions of politicians, well, what should we be doing? Where should we be investing? How should we be investing? What support should we be providing? There's very considerable uncertainty about how disrupted global value chains will be reestablished or are reestablishing themselves in terms of also against the ambitions of greater strategic economy. So that effectively, particularly in terms of industrial reasons, we have the question then in response to climate change, what are the prospects for tourism reliant regions? For large urban centers, what about new approaches to mobility? For rural areas, does digitalized service provision provide new opportunities, and likewise from home working? And that also has implications for urban areas, and particularly urban renewal. Now, just taking the sort of big picture, looking across the kind of policy priorities that we see are on the desk of territorial policymakers across Europe, we see four sets of challenges which they're trying to reconcile. One is the big question, of course, which is the primary obligation of regional policymakers of reducing regional disparities. But then increasingly over the last 10 years, 15 years, we've seen much more targeted territorial action, a focus of policy on particular types of regions, of localities, of places. But then overlying these, there are these grand societal challenges, in particular climate change, as we've just been hearing. And there's the question of how you reconcile this, and that then links to the last of the key issues, which is better policy delivery. And one can see a combination of legislative, institutional, spatial, and operational responses to that. And just picking out for each of those, what are the key questions that are being asked, and where it is that ESPON might find opportunities to contribute. Well, in terms of the big issue of reducing territorial disparities, the overriding question is how the trends that OECD, the EU, and researchers have identified is how do you narrow the widening gap between the leading regions or clubs and others, especially the so-called intermediate regions, those regions that perhaps have known success in the past, that have been successful industrially, but are now stagnating or even declining. A particular question is understanding and exploiting the development potential of small and medium-sized towns, and to what extent they can contribute to rebalancing patterns of economic activity. But there is the question of what works. I mean, there was some really interesting ESPON research published some time ago about the inner peripheries, mapping connectivity and accessibility, which affect a much larger area of Europe than one might anticipate, and particularly small and medium-sized towns are critical in addressing that. And then we hear politicians and policymakers putting a lot of emphasis on the well-being agenda, but there's then somewhat of a disconnect about how more positive and social welfare outcomes can actually be designed and measured in practical terms. We've heard something in the previous round of discussions about targeted territorial action and different geographies. And the big question here is we've seen the proliferation of different geographies at different spatial scales, is how to manage these and achieve coherence. And particularly in terms of governance situations where one's got much more fuzzy relationships, links, networks, how you can manage collaboration and also build in adaptability. The grand societal challenges we've heard quite a lot of, and here, as we've just heard, the question is how to translate the sort of ambitious aspirations and strategic commitments into practice, because we can see some really successful and really promising initiatives in terms of industrial decarbonization, for example, in the energy transition. But essentially at a local or regional scale, and what can one draw out of these in terms of upscaling? And the big then behavioral challenge that we face is how we can avoid negative responses and backlash from citizens in terms of building them in for what are potentially quite radical changes in behavior. And lastly, there is, of course, the big administrative question is how you make these kind of challenges and these kind of policy objectives of work, which is constantly, and we've seen this for a while now, how more effective and efficient methods of territorial policy design and implementation can be engineered. And partly that's an issue of how you get commitment to territorial policy objectives in other policy areas, making them more visible, how you get competences at the right, inverted commas, spatial levels. And there's a big challenge, as we know, of course, from cohesion policy, but it applies also to national territorial policies about building the capacity, the administrative capacity, particularly at local and regional levels. So we have quite an interesting mix of issues, it seems to me, that are on that are underlying the kind of policy thinking and policy debates that we see across governments in Europe. And I think it provides rich, fertile ground, I think, for ESPON to be able to contributing to these policy debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, also for keeping the time and for this very comprehensive proposal on possible research fields and topics. I think this is very good to have. Also, as the previous speakers, to refer to existing studies and results already, because it looks very a bit frightening to deal with this unknowns and complexity, like where do we start with? And we know we already have a lot material, and now you pointed out very well the different aspects and dimensions of resilience that could be tackled also by ESPON. Thank you very much. We come to the next speaker, which is Igor Caldera, from the European Committee of the Regions. Can I invite you to share your presentation, please?
Sure. Good.
You don't need to. Or the.
I can share. I can share the presentation.
Sorry, wrong word. To present your presentation. We have it already. It will be shared automatically. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, indeed, I'm policy officer at the Committee of the Regions, and I work in territorial impact assessments and regional statistics. And as a disclaimer, in the first part of the presentation, I will present a couple of personal reflections on the theme, not necessarily any kind of official position of the Committee of the Regions. I don't want to be overly disruptive, but I do believe that we only aim to achieve what we try to measure, and if we do not ask the right questions, we might be aiming at the wrong things, or at least we are limiting the range of policy options ahead of us. One such example is when we try to limit ourselves to compare disparities between the richest regions and the poorest regions, and completely miss the point on regions that might have a similar outlook in, for example, GDP per capita, and completely miss the point on their different reactions to crisis. And so the topic of the workshop was resilience. The definition, or one of the definitions, was already given, but this concept is not being cemented in European policy, and Europe wants to be resilient to crisis. And according to the definition given by the Commission, you can see here, this is the ability not only to withstand and cope with challenges, but also to undergo transitions in a sustainable, fair, and democratic manner. This is all fine. But I wonder if this is enough. Shouldn't we shouldn't we be striving to do more than just undergo change? Shouldn't we try to accept that change, crises of many sorts, are inevitable, and that we should try to use them to get better? And these two graphics, I don't know if you can now click again in my presentation. Another graphic will appear. Could you please click? Yes. So these lines that we see are very theoretical lines, but in the next slide we will see a real case example. So this is from real life. You can see here two regions. That, if I compare to the previous graphic, correspond more or less to the ideas of fragile, resilient, and anti-fragile territories. One is reacting bad from the financial crisis of 2008. First, it seems that it's doing okay. So that's the line that says that corresponds to fragility. But then it drops, and it takes a long time to recover from it. Another one on the top resists quite well to the shock, almost with no changes. And the third one suffers a very bad reaction and very immediate reaction, but then recovers fast, gets better, and gets even better than before the crisis. What doesn't happen to the fragile region, for example. If you click again on the same graphic, exactly. So here you see the three regions, and what happens to them is that the fragile region, which is, as you can see, the metropolitan area of Lisbon, does not recover until very late from the crisis of 2008, whereas Estonia, which, well, it's the whole country, but it's not still region as well, improves almost consistently. So throughout this 16 years, indeed, it improves consistently, even though it suffered a quite serious shock from the crisis, the financial crisis. So if we move to the next slide, last year the European Commission proposed resilience dashboards designed to bring together in a graphical format indicators of vulnerabilities and resilience capacities at EU and member state level. And at least in the first version of this dashboard, the only two regional elements were present. One was the regional dispersion of household income, and the other was the regional broadband gap. However, many of the dimensions and indicators that are proposed by the Commission also need a regional and not just a national dimension, because this lack of attention to regional imbalances leads to a failure to take into account the significantly different vulnerabilities and capacities across regions. And they exist within member states. Overlooking them will lead to policy planning that does not take into consideration the need to fine-tune actions to different types of regions. And without this adaptation, policy design will be defective and policies will be less effective. So one clear problem is the existence of data at subnational level. It is not evident that to have data in many dimensions, be it for financial and administrative burdens that would impose on statistical authorities, or because the phenomenon itself is difficult to measure in smaller territories. Creating composite indicators could help to overcome some gaps, but it also has methodological challenges. But also, and looking at the dashboard of the European Commission, even if we have a large number of subnational indicators and try to create a subnational resilience dashboard, how will it look? Will it be user-friendly? How would the dashboard with dozens of statistical indicators in several dimensions, multiplied by 242 regions at NUTS 2 level and over 1,000 regions at NUTS 3 level, look like? A preliminary answer from my side is that we should strive to have some parsimonious regional dashboards of territorial resilience, but with online tools that would be available for citizens, researchers, and policymakers to do their own assessment of certain dimensions that are relevant for them. ESPON has a large experience in building online tools. If you can just shift to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. ESPON has a large experience in building online tools and publishing studies that have been widely used by policymakers, and the Committee of the Regions is precisely one of these users. One of my final remarks is that ESPON's potential big contribution is to focus on gaps of official statistics or showcasing new uses of existing data from official sources. And I know that many experts in the field are cautious on this, and they're cautious for very good reasons. But what policymakers love is to have easy and understandable data that can guide policy and inform political communication. And this usually means two things: maps and composite indicators. And so I don't want to suggest many things in particular, but I would put some questions. So the questions are, which are the gaps that official statistics have in terms of depicting and analyzing territorial resilience? And I think this is where ESPON should look at. So, for example, and just to conclude final remarks, if we look back at the different reactions of the three NUTS 2 regions I showed previously, we might not be surprised by the fact that the resilient region, East Flanders, well, it's a rich region in the economic heart of Western Europe, highly connected to other economically strong regions. But how and what can explain the opposite reactions of the metropolitan area of Lisbon and Estonia to the financial crisis? Why has one improved almost constantly while the other declined? Some could speak of, for example, catching up effects in the side of Estonia, but that wouldn't explain why Estonia in 2021 was closer to the European GDP per capita average than Portugal, whereas Portugal departed 20 years ago from being 3 times higher than Estonia.
Dear Mr. Caldera.
Yes, I will finish now. There is plenty of undone research on how to explain in terms of differences of regions across Europe and their reaction to crisis. especially when we discuss peripheral regions of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caldera. Sorry for interrupting you and for giving your last examples. And definitely thank you very much for challenging the scientific community as regards the usefulness and possibly negative effects if not looking at the right level. And understandably, this is a regional and local level to focus research at the right issues and levels. Thank you very much for this, for your contribution. Now it is the last but not least speaker we have, and I invite Javier Velazquez. He is the head of Territorial Observatory of Navarre for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabine. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I feel very good to have the chance to share my professional views about this particular topic, but above all, I feel humbled because of the brilliant presentations that the previous speakers presented. I'm going to share my screen at this point, and I will try to share with you some key messages. And I'm going to do it from my perspective, which is of a small region in Europe. I'm not part of the government. We are an instrument of the government.
Excuse me, can you do the presentation mode? We see...
Sure thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to switch between my web browser and the PPT anyway, so at times I will miss that, but I will try. Will do my best. So anyway, what we do is we help to formulate territorial policies with territorial impact, and we evaluate policies at the regional level with territorial impact. That's what we do. So I have carefully analyzed the thematic action plan, and my first idea that came to my mind was, why thematic action plan? Because in truth, when we hear the word thematic, we think on energy, on water, on biodiversity. But I think this is more of a cross-sectoral approach, which makes a lot of sense from a regional perspective. Because we have to design policies that are of a higher complexity year after year, and that have to deal with the different thematics. So in our case, our challenge is to make things understandable for policymakers. So I'm going to show my first example. So this is an integrated project for climate change. It deals with adaptation. So we have to structure our adaptation, our strategies in pieces of information that are meaningful for policymakers, in the thematics in this case. That's why I mentioned the cross-thematic work. If I go to this particular example, but I could go to any other examples in this chains. My second key message is that we need to link our policy objectives to the indicators that we are going to measure it. And that's linked to what Igor said before, and also to what a friend said before. So, sorry, because it's in Spanish, but in essence, we need to define our objectives, and we have to create visualizations that are understandable for our politicians, for our policymakers, better said, and that they have a say on how they can improve things by applying public policies. So this kind of visualization, what are our goals for policy with regard to climate change, with the mitigation of emissions. But I think this is part of the other thematic action plan, the one dealing with climate change. But adaptation, which is part of the achieving the neutral carbon society that we want to in 2050, it's a must. I don't know if in this thematic action plan or in the other or in both, but adaptation takes place in the local level, in the regional level, not at the national or European level where mitigation takes place or the decisions are made. Decisions in adaptation are taken at this particular scale, regional and local. And now I'm going to talk about resilience and vulnerability, because this is key. This is what this thematic action plan is about, or cross-thematic action plan is about. vulnerability is the other side of the coin when we speak about resilience, at least in our view. And we have no real way to know what are the actual best practices in adaptation. So, we do participation, bottom-up approaches, as were suggested in the previous thematic action plan discussion in the climate change one. So we do that, but from my scientific point of view, we don't know what are the best adaptation options. Because there is few science at this moment, if compared with mitigation, which is very well known and very well developed. So this is something that there is a gap. We need a catalog of best practices in adaptation in climate change. We need that. We are doing that in Navarre, but we don't have the European perspective. We have our own perspective. So we could undoubtedly enrich our job by learning from our peers and the other way around. Then I have been reviewing the different components in the thematic action plan. About the social inequalities, we do the same. And now I'm going to talk about, this is linked to governance, which is another thematic action plan, but nevertheless, it's the same. So we have the 2030 agenda, the sustainable development goals. So we have, this is again, in a sense, what Igor was saying before. We have our objectives, our SDGs, so to speak, and we see the evolution, how we are with respect to others. But this is qualitative based. There is not that much science in this approach. We are following a qualitative approach. So we have the feeling that ESPON, we could benefit of ESPON goals and proposals in this thematic action plan of places resilient to crisis, because this is where the crises are felt at the poverty levels, at the health, at the education level, at the equality level, at the water, energy. This cross-thematic perspective that crises affect too. So. About innovation, digitalization, and automation, I want to introduce another key message from our regional perspective, which is that resilient and vulnerabilities are not your fault, and you can do some to do that by yourself, but that's not actually that true. I'm going to put an example of the ERI project that we are performing at this point. This is a network. This is a place where interactions in Europe are taking place on a daily basis. When we talk about capital flows, when we talk about trade of goods or movement of people, migration, and these kind of things. So this is the kind of information that needs to be passed down to the regional development strategies. How do we interact with other regions? Which are our partners? Which are the regions that we don't interact with? Because our resilience and our vulnerabilities are, of course, dependent on our policy options and the public policies that we implement. And they are, of course, dependent on our governance system, which is key, of course. And they are dependent as well on our territorial characteristics. It's not the same as being a peripheral country in Europe, as Portugal is, as being in the core of Europe, as the Netherlands are. So, of course, all those things are important. But, the way we interact and we engage with others in trade or in movement of capitals or in migration flows within the European Union and these kind of things, they are key. So, this is precisely one of the most key gaps that we have found in the evidence-based policies that we have been helping to formulate, that we know a lot about how we are. That's true for all the regions in Europe with the regional statistics that are provided by Eurostat, but we don't know much about the way that we interact with others. And besides that, that's key to understand what are the drivers and barriers which are the things that are going to be making our vulnerabilities worse or our resilience higher, or the other way around. So we need to understand drivers and barriers. So these are the kind of things that ESPON projects in this new programming period should provide to regions, because by ourselves we are not that strong, but in cooperation we are stronger for sure. So my last messages.
Javier, yes, please come to the end.
Yes, I will do that. So this is my last slide. What we need in this thematic action and in any other tabs, we need to understand what are the stakeholders, what do we have to interact with. We need catalogs of measures, what works, what doesn't work, what are the best practices, okay? We need territorial evidence in a sense of rankings. We need to understand where we are with respect to others. And we need visual and appealing tools. That was said in other presentations. I'm glad that I heard that, because that's a very important truth. So this is what ESPON could provide, and this tab could provide with regard to places resilient to crisis. And I did this very brief SWOT analysis. This is, well, this is not too deep, but the strengths in this tab is that you provide a pan-European perspective and the linkage of the regional and local policies to the EU and national policies. This is a strength of this territorial action plan. A potential weakness is that the data evidence at the regional level, and that was said again by previous speakers, is that they might be costly to obtain, and there are high uncertainties in improving the gathering of this kind of data. There is a huge opportunity in benchmarking and ranking regions. That was said in the top presentation about climate change. We need this. We need to understand our drivers and barriers in dealing with territorial challenges and dealing with our vulnerabilities and resilience. And the risk is that although this cross-thematic action plan is very, very, I mean, it's very well presented, it's risky in a sense that it's very wide. It includes many different sectors, and in a regional government sectors, and I imagine, and I can say that it's the same at the national and at the EU level, we work in boxes. And we tend to get a lot of difficulties in breaking the boundaries of those boxes to cooperate with others. This is a potential risk that could deviate the outcome of projects, of already complex projects. So thank you very much again, and apologies if I used more time than I had to. So this is it.
Thank you very much, Javier. And I give credit to, I think what came out from your presentation, thank you very much, is the cruel reality. The reality on the ground, how to deal with a complex topic or issue as resilience. And I feel a more laid-back attitude, sorry about this from a scientific point of view, because there is not this responsibility, this urgency to deal with these issues. But as you point out, and we have great scientists in the community, it really needs a good cooperation. So thank you very much for sharing this with us. And now we have just a bit of time if some of the speakers feels the urge to comment very quickly on what the other speakers have said. But this can only be like 2 or 3 minutes we give it, because otherwise we cannot get the questions from the audience. Is any one of you from the speakers wanting to have the floor very urgently to comment on the other presentations? You already did a bit in your intervention, but please, you have a few minutes now. Okay, no one really dares to, which is fine, because we will not stop this dialogue or this conversation, of course, now. But we will go on. The whole process of this TAP consultation has started only now. And we will now give the floor to the questions from audience. And I have interesting questions here to the scientists. One is, some crises move slowly, like the rising sea, and others very fast, like flooding, and require substantial different types of responses with different but equally challenging solutions and policy needs. Social changes such as gradual deindustrialization of coal-producing regions compared to the suddenness of lockdown. Should these TAP be designed clearly separate these types of crisis and responses, slow and fast? Who wants to intervene on this? First speaks has the floor.
Sabina, maybe I could
Yes?
start.
Yes, please.
I think,
John?
yeah, I think it's a very good question. I mean, I chaired a meeting this morning on the green transition. Sorry, I have to say one of the problems of the transmission here is that some of the speakers look like tomatoes with bright red faces. I'm not actually sunburnt, I have to say, not in Glasgow. But going back to the going back to the point, as I said, I chaired a meeting this morning on the green transition with coordinating and managing authorities from about 13, 14 countries. And I was reflecting on the implications of that for the discussion we're having now. And there are certain, if you like, crises like flood risk that we understand reasonably well from a policy point of view. We've got environmental agencies have done some excellent mapping in terms of flood risk, which they can refine over time down to a micro level. The responses are not necessarily they're not cheap, but through a combination of physical planning, of economic, social, and other tools, we know how to respond. The challenge that a lot of people that were speaking this morning at the Green Transition conference was that we know what we want to achieve in terms of emissions reductions. We know that we have to go through an energy transition. We know the challenges we know the extent of, for example, decarbonization. And we can break that down in terms of aspects like sustainable tourism, sustainable mobility, and so on. What is much less clear is how to get there. Because of the magnitude of the challenges, the complexity of the different elements that need to be addressed, and the uncertainty in terms of data and tools that are seen as appropriate. Added to that, if one looks at some of the authorities that are responsible, like in the area of cohesion policy, the management authorities. The scale is novel, and that there are deficits in terms of experience, in terms of skill. There are challenges in terms of cooperation across policy sectors, which are of an order of magnitude and complexity which are greater than what has been addressed before. So it's like. I suppose setting out on a journey in an electric car, where you know some of the way, but you don't know the rest of the way, and the maps don't give you sufficient guidance. You're not sure whether the power supply will be sufficient to get you there, and you're not a very good driver anyway. I mean, there are these combinations of complexity and uncertainty, and it's actually breaking those down, to in a manageable way of having timescales that are achievable, and crucially, this point that I made a couple of times, which is how you take people with you, and that seems to me to be one of the biggest challenges that we face.
If I may add something,
yes,
I think that from the policy formulation point of view, we are very good in dealing with crises that happen once and again. It doesn't matter if they are big or small, that they happen once and again. And we are very bad in designing policies for events, for crises that only happens once. It doesn't matter if they are big or small, if they are fast or slow, because for different reasons, we don't know how to operate with it. I can imagine that's why things with climate change are going so slowly. It's the only explanation I mean, it's pure human psychology. We don't know how to deal with it because there are no previous examples, and we don't want to fail. We don't want to be the first to make it wrong. So we are paralyzed. How do we do this? If we wait, maybe we are going to do better. So I think this explains more our response to crisis than maybe other more science-based parameters. But I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your responses. And I just leave it like that. And there will be further discussions on these fundamental issues. There is another question now to John, a follow-up from Victor from the EGTC. Would you suggest ESPON goes more explanatory and addresses new and sudden impacts? And John, you look great, by the way.
Well, thank you. That's very reassuring. It must be my screen then. Yeah, I mean, I think ESPON has always had an element of exploratory work about it. The value I've seen of ESPON is, and I've looked into not just the work that I refer to on inner peripheries, but the work that you did on climate change, but which is now getting a bit out of date. And I'm reassured that there is new work coming on that way. Is to synthesize quite complex cross-disciplinary research and put it, make the results available in a very digestible form, and particularly the quality of mapping and other presentational tools are superb. I think there are probably areas that, and certainly I think over the next year, as we get more data available on the impacts of COVID, and particularly the relative value of different recovery measures that have been used. There is some research now about the degree to which the wrong targets were identified in terms of the support measures, for example. I think that there's a lot of interesting work there because we're certainly not through this pandemic, and this, as Javier said, we're not good at responding to the news. So I think there is a lot of scope, to develop ESPON's work there.
Thank you very much for this answer. There is another one to the policy representatives, and maybe I address it to Igor. Regions are facing several challenges: transition of their economy due to policy goals, as well as the need to respond to different crises. Would that be helpful to break this concept further down to regional policy actions to support regions in strengthening their resilience?
Sorry, I'm trying to reformulate the question.
It's probably more. It's about breaking the concept down, which is the of resilience, to further down to regional policy actions to support the regions in strengthening their resilience.
Yeah, well, the concept itself does not need to be broken down. The analysis of the problems need to be broken down. Because when then policies are going to be defined, if we're only measuring the resilience of the country as a whole, we will not be able to direct policies to the conditions of different regions. I don't know, for example, I live in Belgium, and if you want to address the problems resulting from an economic crisis, Flanders and Wallonia will answer distinctly, because they have a different economical outlook. So I think that's the challenge for the regional level, is that we have sufficient data that is available for policymakers, and second of all, that policymakers themselves, and especially national governments, are willing to pay attention to those differences and to modulate their policies to those differences. Naturally, then there is the issue of subsidiarity and the competences of regional powers, because countries highly centralized will have maybe more difficulties in answering to this, whereas federal states might, in federal states, regions and eventually even municipalities might have more powers to address a certain crisis.
Thank you very much. And I guess also the presentation of Javier was a bit showing this breaking down and the different thematic kind of issues dealing with then on a local level, regional level. Thank you very much. We have one question to Carolina, and this is: how can we integrate approaches across various resilience spheres when each sphere on its own is already highly complex and need to deal with fragmented approaches? How to keep it simple, understandable for policymakers? Carolina.
Yeah, I was trying to comment on this, because there's really a trade-off between the complexity of the topic and the need to keep it simple. For example, the use of indicators. I think indicators are quite easy tool to be translated, to be understood and translated into policy. But then indicators are more about quantity and not quality. Then, of course, indicators take pictures and are not, I think, the most suitable tool to keep track of the dynamics of this phenomenon. So there's really a trade-off, because then the use of more complex instruments like I would say gravity models, hierarchical tools, or spatial technique, then are maybe are able to keep track of some effects and consequences of the shocks, of the reaction to the shocks, but then are really difficult to be translated into policy action for the lower level of governance. I would say municipalities, for example. So I think this is something that we need to investigate, how to keep it simple while trying to have the overview of this evolving and complex phenomena.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer and confirming that this definitely is an issue. I guess it's for all ESPON issues and scientific findings, how they can be translated really for policymakers to be understandable and usable. With this, I would like now to give the floor, and I would like to thank you first of all to the audience and the panel for your contributions and the engaged discussion. Before I give the floor now to Michaela to sum up what you have been saying, and please keep in mind it's ongoing, this process. Michaela, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Sabine. And thank you particularly also to the colleagues who gave the interventions now during this workshop, which I'm really grateful for. I think we really got a lot of very useful and really informative input to our further work on this tab. I heard a lot of commonalities in the feedback we gathered here, so there's certainly an agreement on how complex this specific thematic action plan is, and how there are obvious interlinkages with other tabs, so the one on governance, or also certainly the one on climate neutral territories, and we are aware of that, and that's certainly also something that we need to look into further to further elaborate and refine the different tabs. But I think there will always be interlinkages, which we've also seen with other ESPON projects up until now. There are always certain spheres where topics interlink, and where we then also try simply to get researchers together to exchange, to make the most really of the ongoing work. I found it also interesting to hear from Igor, for instance, that it could also be an idea of showing how I think we've known, and this will certainly continue to be a problem, that there will also be data gaps in the future. I mean, there have always been data gaps, and that is something we continuously need to deal with. But this proposal of showing new ways of using the existing data, which I think is really interesting, and where we probably can also put some thinking into. And also this from Igor saying that we should probably also look at how we can use these crises. And this, Igor, as you certainly also know yourself from following very closely the ongoing COVID project on territorial impacts, and here specifically the social implications, we try to do that exactly there. So really looking at proactive policy measures and how these can be shared with other territories across Europe, so that we do also actually get and derive some benefits out of the crises that happen. So with that, I would really like to thank you all for your very valuable input. Also, please, if you have, following this workshop now here today, if you still have any other ideas, anything you would like to let us know, please don't hesitate to do that, be it via the YAMA platform, where you saw the link earlier in my presentation. You can also find that on our website. You can also simply send us an email. There's a specific email address, consultation@espon.eu. If it's on this specific tab, you can also just send it to me. But please try to be active within the next couple of weeks until end of January, and help us further refine this thematic action plan with your input and your ideas. Thank you very much to everyone.
So with this, I would then like to close this session, this workshop. Again, thanking you very much. And I have to say, I was, as the previous workshop, very pleased that with this complex and sometimes abstract topic, we got a lot of concrete input, concrete ideas. And I can go back now to my colleagues from the Interreg Northwest Europe program, because we had discussing territorial resilience, and there was some great reluctance to deal with this expression and to deal with the issue, because it's not concrete enough. It's more something in the air, and so that we can really work with this, that something will emerge to work with this concept and to kind of use it for concrete problems and concrete policy responses. I want to thank very much the whole team that has been working for these sessions and workshops. You haven't seen colleagues from the technique walking around so that it will not get dark here. And the great support from ESPON Managing Authority, ESPON EGTC. And thank you again very much, everyone, and have a nice evening and relaxation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.